So, fighting monsters is undoubtedly one of the biggest parts of D&D. When done right, it's incredibly fun for both players and dungeon masters to imagine the heroes duking it out against ferocious beasts, cunning devils, enormous dragons, and even stranger creatures. That said, some monsters are more conducive to great adventures than others. For every iconic creature like the Goblin or Mind Flayer, there's a handful more that might be useful as occasional minions, but lack the mechanical depth or scare factor to make an encounter interesting by themselves, and don't have the narrative power to drive a non-combat encounter. But if you ask me, there are still very many creatures that can be just as threatening as the classics, and potentially even more so if you have players who are getting tired of orcs and dragons. So for this video, I've listed 7 monsters that are in the original monster manual, and that I think are underappreciated by dungeon masters. Right off the bat, this raises the question of what exactly a great monster is. And I would say that a great monster has an interesting set of mechanics, a threatening appearance and overall vibe, and is either viable as an overarching villain, or lends itself to some sort of really unique encounter. Also, all the monsters in this video are challenge rating 10 or lower because I know the vast majority of D&D parties are low to mid-level, so here we go. The Oni is absolutely terrifying. It's got a huge glaive and the strength of an ogre, but that's pretty much the least threatening thing about it. On top of this, the creature has a whole suite of supernatural powers that the players wouldn't expect from something that seems like a brute, including a darkness spell, invisibility, charm, sleep, ice breath, gaseous form, shape-shifting, and regeneration. That's more than enough to drive a whole session of conflict for a party of appropriate level, with both combat and non-combat challenges, even without a single minion on its side. And it lives to hunt human children, so that's a threat that can write an adventure by itself. To top it off, the Oni comes from a non-Western mythology, Japanese in this case, which I think is pretty cool. Even if you really want your world to be European-inspired, you can just change the name to something like Ogre Mage, like the book suggests. Or just say that it flew over from a faraway land. I mean, tourists can be evil too. Next up, the Revenant is basically a fantasy Terminator, if the Terminator was undead and could move into a new body once it was destroyed. But otherwise, I think that's basically an accurate descriptor. This creature has a pretty crazy amount of hit points for a CR5 creature, plus regeneration, and it's immune to turn undead. It always knows the location of its sworn target, and it'll stop at nothing to enact its revenge. So, if one of your PCs kills some kind of evil cleric or paladin too early, you can let it rise as this even greater threat to keep them on the edge for a while longer. Quite a while, in fact, because as I mentioned earlier, their souls will find a new body 24 hours after the old one is destroyed. The only way to stop this in the rules as written is through a wish spell. Now, obviously, dungeon masters can make up other ways to get rid of a Revenant, but it should be no easy task given this precedent. At first glance, the Cloaker just looks like another ugly creature living in the Underdark, but if you look at its stat block, it's actually got a plethora of unique abilities. For one, it's indistinguishable from a normal cloak when motionless, which can give a nasty surprise to whichever adventurer is first to check out a pile of loot. Secondly, it has a moan attack that can frighten the PCs and possibly lure other aberrations into the area. Thirdly, it can attach itself to a humanoid creature, blinding and suffocating its victim while gaining advantage on all its subsequent attacks. If another PC hits the Cloaker while it's attached to someone, the PC will only deal half the damage to the Cloaker and the other half to the attached PC. Finally, it can create 3 illusory duplicates of itself once per short rest, leaving the heroes blindly guessing which one is the real one. This thing is pretty deadly. Next up, the Flameskull is pretty much the perfect low-level counterpart to the Lich. For starters, the idea of a maniacal floating skull wreathed in flame is sufficiently creepy. Sure, it's a bit cartoonish, but most D&D games are. As expected, it's got plenty of fire-based attacks that are pretty devastating for a CR4 creature, as well as some defensive options like a shield spell and resistance and immunities to a whole bunch of damage types. At the end of the day, its hit point count isn't very impressive, but it shouldn't be in a position where it's easy to hit. This is a clever and devious dungeon-dwelling mastermind. It should be living in something like a tall underground chamber and flying out of reach of melee-focused PCs, using minions to engage them on the ground while blasting the heroes with fire rays. This would be an especially difficult encounter at low levels, because the PCs wouldn't be able to fly very easily. Plus, don't forget that this thing can come back to life after an hour if the PCs don't sprinkle holy water over its remains. The Ettercap is essentially Spider-Man if he were a Tim Burton villain, and I mean that in the best way possible. Look at this thing. It's an intelligent humanoid arachnid that herds spiders around like hunting dogs. A group of novice adventurers stumbling over a silken tripwire and falling into a twisting cave controlled by spiders and led by this monstrosity can be a perfect and suitably dangerous low-level encounter. Remember that webs will be difficult terrain for the adventurers, but not the spiders or Ettercap, so there'll be no escape, just kill or be killed. The Githyanki probably aren't appropriate in every game, but I still really like them, and think that they aren't appreciated much, and they're especially useful if you want to add a dash of sci-fi tropes to your D&D game. They're essentially space pirates, technically astral pirates I guess, but they still ascend to the Earth from great flying ships coming from a realm beyond the stars, so I think it still counts. Unlike some of the other creatures in this video, the Githyanki come with some really cool lore. Millennia ago, they were slaves to the Mind Flayers, but they rebelled against their masters in order to live in freedom and fight for the interests of their own race. By now though, they've gradually fallen under the tyrannical rule of the Lich Queen Vlaakith. Given the existence of their less martially inclined cousins, the Githzerai, this suggests that a war-obsessed culture will inevitably lead to tyranny, which is a genuinely interesting moral message that I don't think is too complex for the average D&D game. Lore aside, the Githyanki have some really cool mechanics too, including silver greatswords and an impressive set of psychic powers. If you're running a mid-level game and want space hobgoblins, these guys are a great choice. My last entry here is another interesting humanoid creature, the Quotoa. These fishy creatures used to dominate the surface world, but are now confined to the lower reaches of the Underdark, and they're a great choice if you want any kind of Lovecraftian themes in your game. Depending on how you portray them, these creatures can either be silly or scary, potentially both. The silly part is that they make up their own bizarre gods, which they often base on ruined or poorly made statues of other species with mismatched body parts. The scary part is that these creatures worship them so fanatically that these gods can actually become real. Honestly, their entry in the monster manual is so good at describing the fanatical culture of these slimy creatures that I don't think there's any point in me paraphrasing the whole thing here, so go check it out. And don't gloss over the stat blocks either. There are effectively 4 different types of Quotoa there, each with unique abilities. And of course, they're not likely to be encountered without at least a semblance of the creatures that they venerate. So yeah, those are 7 creatures in the original monster manual that I think are underappreciated by dungeon masters. Let me know if you want to share an experience with those monsters, or if you'd like to mention your own favorite creature. Anyway, I hope you all enjoyed the video. I'll try to get back to making D&D related videos. See you all next time.